Welcome to the Vietnamese Poetry Literature channel. Today we will listen to the beginning work of author Thach Lam. Let's listen. Honey, come here and I'll tell you something. Nung still looked down at the needle, not looking up. She instructed, "What does Lone say? This is great. Just come out here and I'll tell you." "Oh well, I'm still busy sewing a new shirt for Bitch." Lone didn't listen and insisted on calling. "Just leave it to me, it's a great story. Go sister." Nung was a bit annoyed at my petulant nature. She put her new shirt in the basket and walked out. "Let's see what my sister said that makes me so needy." Lone turned around in her chair to look at her, smiling, her eyes sparkling. "Come down here, the wind is very cool." In the garden, sunlight flashed through the trees. Nung stepped on the soft grass and sat down on the rattan chair next to her. Seeing Lone looking mischievous, she said seriously, "Say whatever it is. Don't joke around and die with me." Lone's eyes were still sparkling. She quickly wiped away the smile that was about to bloom on her lips, leaned closer to her sister's ear, slightly red from embarrassment. "Sister, hey sister, when will Min come down to visit, right?" Nung laughed and slapped her cheek. "But I thought, you just made me miss my work. When he comes down to play, ask him, not me." Nung tried to get up and leave, but Lone quickly grabbed her shirt and begged, "No, just sit here for a bit. This morning I saw my mother saying that Mr. Bin would come down tomorrow." This time it was Nung's turn to blush. "She was angry with me. She's only good at joking around." "No, I'm telling the truth. Mom told the teacher that if she wanted to finish the work quickly, she would ask Bin to come down, and the teacher had already written the paper." Nung was silent for a moment, then asked her, "So he went down alone?" "Probably so. But Mr. Bin still needs someone to help him. He's like family, after all. Who knows?" Lone grabbed her hand and argued, "That's not what it means, you still deny it." Nung remained silent and did not respond. Lone also stopped talking. She thought slowly and gently. Because of the mention of Bin's name, the image of her beloved Min, her Min, appeared before her eyes, the image of a quick-witted young man, with bright eyes, always reaching out to close his eyes. Hair loose on forehead. Such a lovely person. Lone shyly remembers the times when he would secretly hold her hand, in the corner of the garden. Her heart beat faster and a feeling of calmness overwhelmed her. The afternoon has come. The sunlight is so close to the roof that it barely touches the blades of grass. A bunch of big willow leaves standing in the middle of the yard burst into sunlight. The loose willow silk will vibrate because of the light wind. The leaves are thin and long, as clear as thin silk and as bright as the eyelashes of cheerful girls. The two Lone sisters sat looking at the garden and fields displayed before them. Lush, green trees surround the brick houses of her camp. Every afternoon, the two sisters would put out chairs and sit on the grass in front of the house, reading books or talking, waiting for the cool breeze from the fields to blow in. But this afternoon was more gentle for the two of them than any other afternoon. Lone glanced at Nung and saw that she seemed to be thinking about herself. Long and black eyebrows will frown in a familiar way to Lone, making Nung's face look a bit serious. She guessed that she was thinking about something important, about Mr. Bin, probably. Lone respected her thoughts and quietly took a deep breath of the clear air following the wind. Her breasts swelled, lightly brushing against the thin, cool silk of her shirt. A warm feeling gradually spread throughout her body, leading her into a pleasant softness. Lone wants to hug someone, just a pure and wholesome embrace. She thought of Min and smiled. Suddenly Lone turned around. She did not know when her mother had arrived. Lone heard the chair creak under her mother's weight because she said she was fat. Then her mother's gentle and familiar face warmed the meeting. Her eyes also sparkled brightly. Her mother is very confused, Lone thought. She must have something to say. "Mom, don't you go play in town?" She put her hands on her thighs and looked towards her. "Don't come in anymore." Every day, the women hunted shrimp nests until morning and were so tired. Nung said, "Mom often stays up late so she's very tired." The judge looked at her silently. Lone wanted to talk more, but suddenly she realized that sitting here was redundant. The judge seemed to be waiting for her to stand up and go away so she could talk about something more personal. Lone looked at her sister. Nung lowered her face to her feet, her long eyelashes brushing the shadow of her slightly red cheeks. Nung is also waiting for an important story. "Oh, so she's the only one who's not important?" Lone had the feeling that her mother and sister Nung had always treated her like a child, only letting her hear the small and sweet things. A little offended, Lone folded her shoes under her feet and said, "The wind is so cool. Go out to the fields and play for a bit." She stood up gracefully in her thin silk dress. At the end of the garden, Lone turned around. Sure enough, Nung and her mother were huddled together. What about Nung's relationship? How can it be so secret? Can you two just get married? It's so simple, but no one seems to have thought of it. Lone picked leaves in the garden as she walked, resting and thinking. Ms. Nung's attitude surprised Lone. Recently, she has become serious and serious. She doesn't always laugh and joke with Lone anymore, just because of getting married. Mr. Bin is also adorable. Marrying Nung is truly a match. Lone also vaguely knew that since Mr. Bin's family was poor, the judge did not want to marry Nung to him anymore, despite the old agreement. Lone felt resentful for him and angry at her mother. Poor or poor, but what can they do? But didn't she do that for Nung? Lone still remembers one day, hearing her mother say to her teacher, "Now if we marry him, Nung and her daughter will suffer. As parents, we have to know how to love our children." Specializing in troublesome people. Lone doesn't understand who's right, she just feels sorry for Nung, who seems to think a lot about it. "I love Mr. Bin very much. Just like Lone loves Min." Lone walked out the gate. Green rice fields appear before your eyes. In the sky, purple and pink fans spread widely from the east to the west. In the falling fog, frogs echoed one by one, gently rising high in the air. If only Min were here, to hang out together, Lone would be so happy. Lone sat down on the grass on the side of the road, fiddling with the machine and pulling out the sewing machine. Min is as poor as Bin, no different. Lone thought dreamily, will you also prevent Lone from marrying Min in the future? But that thought was only fleeting. Lone only felt love. Her soul blooms to welcome love like a hat tree welcomes rainwater. She loved Min like a child just starting to love, passionate and dazzled by her own love. Lone sighed softly. When will Min come down here? He promised to come back to Lone's house this vacation. The two of them crept into the garden as usual, under the happy eyes of their teacher and mother. Lone remembered Min's rosy face when he turned around and stroked the hair falling from his forehead. Fairy love. The lights were on in the house and Lone returned. Nung and her mother's facial expressions were somehow different from usual. An important look still lingered in the two people's posture. Lone guessed something must have happened. Ms. Nung's eyes were a little red, as if she had just cried, but there was a glint of joy when she looked at everyone. She seemed to be thinking, sitting in such a daze that Lone approached without even realizing it. Lone was upset because she was left out of an important story. She walked to the drinking table, poured water into the cup and raised the kettle's spout to make a loud noise, but no one noticed. When it was time to bring the lamp into the room to go to bed, Lone glanced at her, waiting for something to be said. But Nung did not open her mouth, her lips pursed tightly in a determined look. Not paying attention anymore, Lone went to bed. She pulled up the thin blanket and held it, comfortably stretching her limbs on the mattress. For the second time, her breasts swelled under the thin, smooth fabric. A feeling of profound ecstasy rose up and flooded the whole person into it, like when bathing in a swimming pool. Lone closed her mouth on the edge of the blanket, stretched her legs out straight, and then quietly looked at the milky white curtain under the light. She saw Min smiling at her up there. The cozy room became so lonely. A sob would sound. Lone listened carefully. Ms. Nung. She leaned over and looked at her sister's bed. The curtains were still hanging down, and Nung's breathing was still even. Did Lone hear wrongly? Ms. Nung. Ms. Nung. Lone's voice sounds strange. There was no answer. Nung's breathing is still steady. Rest assured, Lone returned to her beautiful dream. Happy, she closed her eyes, letting the darkness come, cool and brilliant, enveloping her soul and body. In the middle of the night, Lone suddenly woke up. She wistfully opened her eyes to look. The lights were brighter and the room seemed full of hidden human activity. Lone immediately thought of Ms. Nung. Where is Ms. Nung? She propped herself up and looked outside. Ms. Nung sat crouched on the table, in front of the lamp. Her shadow is vast on the wall. Lone threw off the blanket and sat up. Nung suddenly heard a noise and quickly leaned down and turned her face away. Ms. Nung, what are you doing? Quiet. Lone stuck her body out of the screen and looked strange. Ms. Nung. Did Lone think wrong? Gently she walked up behind her sister, placed her hands on Nung's shoulders, bowed her head to her cheek, and touched. Sister, are you crying? How do you cry? Nung did not answer. After a moment, she brought up the towel to wipe, placed her hand on Lone's hand, then looked up at me, smiling through her tears. What can you do? Haven't you slept yet? Lone said no more. Confide in Ms. Nung. What can I do? She sat down next to her sister, lovingly. Let's go rest too, it's late at night. The lighting of the lamp should be soft and intimate. Nung's eyes were still sparkling and wet through the tangled hair on her forehead. The two sisters looked at each other, and Lone felt so much respect and love for her. What is Ms. Nung sad about? Lone thought about the important story between her mother and Ms. Nung just now, her mother's absent-minded expression. She naturally smiled, imagining Min's image, and said, I had just fallen asleep when you woke up. Nung sighed, turned away, and told her sister, well, go rest. The two sisters quietly entered the scene. As Lone pulled the blanket over her head, she glanced aside and saw Ms. Nung letting down the curtain, her hand still, her eyes looking at her thoughtfully. Lone quickly pulled her head in and covered herself with the blanket to sleep. Ms. Nung is about to return to her husband's house. That was it. My mother agreed to let me marry Mr. Bin. The day the groom's family arrived, Lone was so happy that she ran to find her sister. But Nung was sewing clothes as usual in the room. Lone came closer and said cheerfully, I'm happy for you and for Mr. Bin. Nung lifted her up in her arms and kissed her cheek. Her eyes sparkled brightly. That's all my brother gets. Lone pressed her body against her sister and joked, from now on, you won't cry anymore. Nungan looked into the distance, her cheeks turning red. Lone saw that in her happiness there was a bit of sadness mixed in, a distant fear, like a bit of mist at dawn. She knew that Ms. Nung was about to go to a near future, another world. She is about to embark on a new life, building her own happiness or suffering with her own hands. The two sisters will eventually be apart. Lone put his arm around her shoulder lovingly. Intimacy lasts a long time. Today is the day to welcome the bride. Lone was very happy, because the house was bustling with people coming and going. The house is splendidly decorated, the tables are covered with new white cloths, and baskets of flowers of all colors are full. All relatives in the house were present. Lone quickly walked among those people. Sometimes she listened to the old ladies talk about Nung, then whispered about her, pointing discreetly. But in her heart, Lone is happily waiting. Lone is waiting for Min, because today he will come back to marry her. She looks forward to every train. Why hasn't Min arrived yet? Suddenly, in the middle of a conversation with Ms. Lone, he calmed down. He had entered. Perhaps he was taking off his hat, his hair falling on his forehead, his eyes moving quickly, a bit awkward. Lone didn't turn around, didn't look out. She heard her mother say, Mr. Min, you're down, please come in. And Min's voice answered softly. Min sat down on the chair. He's looking at me, Lone saw. She continued the story with her aunt. At that time, the house was too crowded, but that thought did not make her impatient, nor did the people around her, nor did the extra sentences she had with her aunt. Those things didn't make Min stay away from her. Lone still smiled and talked, still listened, still responded, like in a dream. She is awake in her heart and in Min's heart. Happy, Lone went to find Nung in the room, rosy-cheeked in her new dress, among the bridesmaids. Ms. Nung looks so beautiful, divinely beautiful and noble. Lone came closer and playfully tried to tease her, but her smile softened and she bit her lip, because Ms. Nung just looked at Lone, with a slightly serious, slightly sad look. Lone felt confused in her heart, as if she vaguely understood something that Lone didn't know what it was. She stood quietly beside her sister, listening to the small laughter of the bridesmaids. A moment later, Mrs. Fan entered. Lone saw that her mother seemed content and happy, smiling happily at the polite demeanor of the bridesmaids. Mother looked at Nung lovingly and gently, looked at Lan, Hong, Tu Bitch, then looked at Lone and joked, and this baby. Next year I will give you a husband, you guys will come back for the wedding. 4 beautiful mouths, 4 bright smiles. Yes. Lone suddenly thought of Min, was so embarrassed that her cheeks turned red, then ran out. Night came, the house was quiet again. Ms. Nung has returned to her husband's house. I wonder what she is doing now. Lone looked over at her bed, the mat was still neatly arranged, and an old pillow stood alone. Her bed is more cozy. Have you seen it yet? Lone tried to guess whether he was awake or asleep, or sitting reading a book by the lamp. She was nervous. In the afternoon, when she overheard her mother inviting Min to stay, Lone was so happy that she pretended to lower her face to the beetle box. That's why now Min is nearby and thinks of her. In the mist, Lone looked at the objects in the room, the objects that were used to Ms. Nung's presence. Lone saw that they had the cheerful and unreasonable look of the objects she looked at when she was a child. Vacation. She went to the office door and looked out into the garden. The blue moon shadow poured in through the canopy of tree leaves. The wind blew coolly on both sides of her neck, her hair fluttering. Lone remembered Min's loose hair when he turned to call her, that day, in the garden. Under the shirt, the fabric is smooth, poignant. Lone's chest expands, she breathes heavily, her hands grasp the door bars tightly. Where is Ms. Nung? The wedding room is filled with flowers and wishes, 4 love affairs, next to the bin sentence that my sister loves. You are starting a new life, full of joy, but why are your eyes serious? The moonlight shines brightly into the room. Lone smelled the fragrant scents in the garden growing stronger and stronger. Lone also loves passionately and happily. The darkness under the tree canopy is intimate and inviting. The familiar garden path between the two sides is an extremely cozy small path. Lone will be long. She trembled and struggled under the seductive call. Then Lone gingerly smoothed her hair, she gently went out, stood at the door, heard her heart beating loudly under her shirt. One step, another step, the steps lower down to the porch. The grass on my feet is a bit cold from the dew. Lone. She had already reached the middle of the garden, looking around in shock as if in a dream. How long has Min been waiting there? His arms will hug Lone's body, his mouth will come closer, Lone will be so happy, she will close her eyes. She woke up next to Min, next to him, under the shade of a cool tree. Lone wanted to say but didn't know what to say. She opened her heart to a strange joy, a different world she had just entered. At the end of the work, please support me with the like button and subscribe to the channel to listen to more works.